All right, hi everyone, welcome to week 5. In this lecture, we'll be talking about the endocrine system, as well as we'll start to get into the introduction on neurons and mostly just talking about the anatomy of those neurons. All right, so signaling pathways. There's 4 pathways that you need to be very familiar with. So you have the endocrine pathway, which is where there's specialized glands that produce hormones to reach target cells by going through the bloodstream. And this is a long distance type of signaling. We'll talk more about it in the next slide. Then next is paracrine, which is where there's the release of hormones to act on neighboring cells, and this is something that's very common in initial immune response. The next we'll talk about is autocrine, and this is when the cell that is secreting the hormone is also the one that receives the hormone, and this often leads to some sort of positive feedback loop. Lastly is the nervous system, and this is when signaling uses neurotransmitters and neurohormones between neurons and other types of cells at the synapses. And we'll talk again more about that in a bit. So now let's talk about endocrine versus the nervous system. So the endocrine system is pretty slow. It usually takes quite a few seconds to actually complete, versus the neuron system is extremely fast and it's a fraction of a second. The duration, endocrine, is long-lasting versus the nervous system is very brief. Specificity, you've got the endocrine system, which is like a broadcast system. So it goes all throughout the entire body through your hemolymph or your blood, but only the target cells will react. So only the cells that have the specialized receptors for the hormone will actually change, versus the nervous system, only a very specific cell is actually receiving the signal, because at the end of your neuron is going to just be that one target cell. So it's not acting as a broadcast system. It's very specific. Now, if we talk about how the stuff is being transported, in the endocrine system, we have a system of glands that are secreting and producing hormones that go through the bloodstream, versus in the nervous system, we have signals that are traveling only through these neurons to the specific cell that they're trying to communicate with. And then when we look at both endocrine and nervous system, they're both using chemical messengers, whether it be hormones or neurotransmitters or neurohormones. They both are using something. The feedback loops can be used as regulators for both of these processes. They can be negative or positive. And then lastly, they're both used for just regulation of homeostasis. All right, so now let's talk about the different signaling molecules. So we've got hormones, which essentially what a hormone is just something that's being secreted into the bloodstream, and it can be one of these types of signaling molecules. So they could be steroids, which are like modified lipids, amines, which you can think of as modified amino acids, and lastly, you have peptide chains or proteins. And remember, peptide chains is just a small protein that doesn't have any folding occurring yet. Next are neurotransmitters, which are signaling molecules secreted into the synapses. So this is something that we'll talk about later in the course, but just know that these are specific to your nervous system. They can diffuse short distances to a target cell very fast, which can then possibly trigger another electric impulse. Next, we'll look at the neurohormones, which are just brain neuron hormones that enter the bloodstream. So it's kind of a mixture between hormones and neurotransmitters. These can regulate water balance, body temperature, and sexual maturity. Lastly, we'll talk about pheromones, which are chemicals that are secreted outside of the body to affect other individuals, which usually affect specifically their behavior. So this is used for species recognition, social interaction and reproduction, navigation, and territory making. All right, so now let's talk about some hormone signaling. So first we need to know that there's 2 main categories for hormones, and it affects how they're going to go through reception, migration, and response. So you've got water soluble and then lipid soluble. So water soluble, you have to remember these are going to be polar compounds, and polar compounds are not able to just go through lipid bilayers because that's a non-polar area, right? So for reception, after a cell receives some sort of signal and is told, hey, release this hormone, we need it, the water-soluble hormones have to be exocytosed from the cell. So you can see that here, because they can't diffuse through that membrane. Versus when you look at those lipid-soluble hormones, they can diffuse out of the cell, because remember, the membrane is nonpolar. Lipid soluble means that these are also nonpolar, so they can diffuse through freely. However, when we're talking about migration, there's a difference between the water and lipid based on how they get into the your blood vessels, as well as how they're going to be able to move. So these water soluble, they can just diffuse straight in and then become dissolved with the blood and move along, versus the lipid soluble are going to need special carrier proteins to actually move them because they can't dissolve into the aqueous environment. Now, if we look at the response between these two, the water soluble, again, they can't diffuse through this membrane, so the receptors, the receptor proteins or the signal receptors are going to be found on the exterior of the cell, embedded in that membrane. Versus in the lipid soluble, since they can diffuse through the membrane, there's no need to have the special protein embedded in that membrane. It can be found somewhere within the cell where it will then later bind to it and cause some sort of reaction or signal transduction. Okay. Awesome. So now we're going to talk about the hypothalamus and pituitary glands and their role in the endocrine system. So the hypothalamus is a region of the brain that can detect things like the change in body temperature. And like I said, it's part of the endocrine system. It can release hormones that communicate with other systems and then trigger different responses. So immediately we can see the hypothalamus can typically it's going to trigger some sort of hormone release that can affect the anterior or posterior pituitary glands. So the anterior pituitary gland, which you can see just right here, marked with the A, can make and release its own hormones, and those can be classified into two categories. You can have non-trophic hormones, which will act directly on non-endocrine tissues. So if it acts on a gland, then that would be considered a trophic hormone, because it can act by, it's indirectly acting by stimulating other glands. So trophic will act on other organs or glands part of your endocrine system, versus non-trophic hormones are only acting on things that aren't a part of the endocrine system, so like the target cells. Next, we can talk about the posterior pituitary gland. So that's right here, and this is going to store and secrete hormones that are made in the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus will make the hormones and then store them in this pituitary gland, and they'll be later released when needed. And some two that you should remember are vasopressin, also known as ADH, which is antidiuretic hormone, and oxytocin. We'll be talking about antidiuretic hormone later in the quarter, so don't forget about that. All right, so now let's talk about epinephrine and Tiger King. So first off, we've got, here's Joe Exotic from the very popular documentary series Tiger King, and here's a liger. So in this episode or segment, there's some sort of thing on his boot that made this liger very interested in it, and it ended up causing the liger to attack him. Now what that's going to be doing is, right here we can see that this is a stimulus. This liger attacking him is causing the peripheral nervous system to send a signal to the brain, which is your central nervous system. Again, we'll talk about that later in another video. That central nervous system is then going to tell the hypothalamus, hey, we should probably start making CRH, which is a hormone that you don't have to know about, just I want to talk about how this all works together. So your hypothalamus here is going to produce CRH that will stimulate your anterior pituitary gland. Now, the anterior pituitary gland is going to secrete ACTH into the bloodstream. So this is going to be endocrine signaling. And then that's going to eventually reach your adrenal glands, which are on top of your kidneys. Now, your adrenal glands are going to make epinephrine and then release it throughout your bloodstream. And that can lead to pathways like this, where you start breaking down glycogen into glucose to help stimulate increased heart rate, increased muscle strength, and also will end up increasing your blood pressure. So this is how you can see everything working together in unison. All right, so I'm going to ask a quick question. So you've got ACTH is a hormone made by the anterior pituitary gland and stimulates the adrenal gland to make and release epinephrine. Is ACTH a trophic or non-trophic hormone? So this is a really good test exam question, because it tells you in this, you don't have to know what ACTH is, but it will tell you in here whether it's trophic or non-trophic. So I'll pause, give you a second to think about it. All right, so it's going to be a trophic hormone. Remember, that means it's indirectly acting by stimulating other glands. So ACTH is made by the pituitary gland, but it's stimulating the adrenal gland. So we've got, it's not stimulating a direct, it's not having a direct effect, rather it's stimulating another gland. The next gland in this case is the adrenal gland, which is releasing epinephrine. And epinephrine here would be considered a non-trophic hormone because it's actually going to be having a direct effect. Okay, so now let's end this video by talking about some simple neuron anatomy. So some things to know is the soma. This is just where, this is like the cell body, it's this area here, it's where you're gonna find organelles. Next thing you should know about are these dendrites. This is where the cell will receive stimuli. Next is the axon hillock, and this is where the initial nerve impulse occurs that can lead to action potentials down the axon. So the axon is just this elongated part of the cell that is where your action potentials will occur, and we'll talk more about that in the next video. Lastly, you've got your synaptic terminals or axon terminals, and this is going to be the specialized area within your axon that contains your neurotransmitters or neural hormones. Okay, so here's the one that I showed you just before. This is what we call a demyelinated neuron. This is a myelinated neuron. So the only difference is they have these myelin sheaths, which are produced by a special glia, which is called a Schwann cell. So this right here is a specialized glia that secretes myelin to form myelin sheaths around the axon of the neuron. And what these do is they're going to increase the speed of your action potentials. And again, we'll talk about it in another video. All right, one more important thing to know about is you can refer to cells as presynaptic or postsynaptic. So presynaptic cells will always be a neuron, and that's just having some sort of action potential that will eventually lead or connect to the postsynaptic cell. Now this can change based on different circumstances. It's not always a neuron. So right here at the synapse, you can have two different types of synapses. You can have a chemical synapse, which we'll talk about this mechanism later, or you can have an electrical synapse. So an electrical one, you have these specialized gap junctions that are going to allow the current to flow from one neuron to another. So that's pretty exclusive to neurons. Now the other types of postsynaptic cells that I mentioned include like muscle fibers, another neuron, or gland cells. All right, so hopefully now you know all the basics of neuron terminology and you're ready to learn more about how these neurons are functioning using action potentials, which we'll cover in the next video. So thank you for watching. Feel free to ask questions by emailing us or leave them in the comment section. Also be sure to try to sign into that link in the description if you can. So thank you.